All right, so welcome everyone to our third and final webinar of our Indian River Lagoon Aquatic Preserves Pollinator Month series. This final webinar is Bountiful Bees, bee identification. So the goal of our Indian River Lagoon Pollinator Month is to bring attention to the importance and benefits of lagoon-friendly landscaping within the Indian River Lagoon watershed, while making bee and butterfly monitoring accessible to a wider audience. We usually teach these classes in person in Titusville, but we're excited to offer them as webinars for Pollinator Month in order to reach more and more folks within the watershed and beyond. So some of you may have joined to learn about bees in our region, where others have joined to complete the final webinar for your bee and butterfly citizen science training so that you can start volunteering for us at our bee and butterfly garden in Titusville. So my name is Emily Sermont. I'm with, of course, the Indian River Lagoon Aquatic Preserves, and thank you all for joining us, whether you're joining to just learn a little bit more about bees or joining us to become one of our new volunteers. Either way, we're going to go ahead and dive in. So please see tonight's presentation agenda on the screen. Again, if you all are having any technical difficulties, please let me know in the chat. We can use reactions as well to communicate a little bit if you're able to find them at the top of your screen. But we are going to use the chat box for Q&A and for all of our communication back and forth. We are not going to use the Q&A function. Instead, we're going to use the chat box. That way everything's in one place and I can scroll through and see everything at once instead of having to press through different tabs. This webinar is being recorded. You are all muted and all of your cameras are off. So no need to worry about that, but this webinar is being recorded so it can be uploaded to our YouTube channel for volunteers to be able to go back and watch as a little bit of a refresher. Okay, so you are joining a webinar tonight hosted by Indian River Lagoon Aquatic Preserves, which is one of the small offices amongst the bigger Florida Department of Environmental Protection. So if you all haven't met anyone from DEP before, we are the state's lead agency for environmental management and stewardship. So state parks are run through DEP. Florida has an environmental resource permitting program. Also DEP compliance makes sure that our air and our water is up to par within the state of Florida. So we are essentially the main agency to take care of all things environmental and land management in the state. So DEP is huge, and the Indian River Lagoon Aquatic Preserves office is one small little office in this giant organization, but we do a lot of great work, I think. So the Indian River Lagoon Aquatic Preserves manages 7 aquatic preserves across 6 counties and 6 traditional indigenous territories. We manage around 97,112 acres, which includes over 150 of the spoil islands you find in the Indian River Lagoon. Most of our work focuses on research, stewardship, and outreach, and we do a myriad of things, including seagrass surveys, oyster reef monitoring, bird nesting monitoring, horseshoe crab population studies, diamondback terrapin population studies, and much, much more. So quick little review for those of you who are not here for our first 2 parts of our webinar series. The entire reason that the Indian River Lagoon Aquatic Preserves got involved in bees and butterflies is because of the Indian River Lagoon watershed. So a watershed is a land area that channels rainfall into creeks, streams, rivers, and eventually to outflow points. So if you look on the map here on the right, you can see the area in darker orange is all of the landmass that makes up the Indian River Lagoon watershed. So you can see the barrier island is all part of the Indian River Lagoon watershed, as well as quite a bit of land to the west. In the southern area of the lagoon in particular, the watershed goes all the way out into Okeechobee County, and in that southern Martin County, it even connects with Lake Okeechobee in times when there are emergency releases. So in Florida, we have lots of canals and rivers and storm drains that have made this watershed really big, and development within the Indian River Lagoon watershed has increased nutrient loading associated with fertilizer, lawn care chemicals, pond maintenance, herbicides, and pesticides, and that sort of yucky lawn care stuff. So in our first webinar, Buzz About Lagoon-Friendly Landscaping, we talked about how freshwater runoff has increased due to development in our area. And that increase in runoff has brought this increase in sort of chemicals and pollutants. So everyone who lives within the watershed can make a difference to lessen the amount of particularly lawn care chemicals, but also other pollutants that are making its way into the watershed. So if you live within that dark orange region, what you do on your chunk of land greatly impacts the water condition of the Indian River Lagoon. And even if you don't live within that dark orange area, no matter where you live on Earth, you live within a watershed. So the actions that you take on land directly impact your nearby water bodies. So the DEP Titusville Native Plant Pollinator Garden was created to serve as a community demonstration garden to promote these lagoon-friendly landscaping practices that we talk about in our region, and also provide habitat for native bees and butterflies. So residents who incorporate Florida-friendly landscaping can help lessen that pollution that's running off into the watershed, and also provide for a myriad of fun and cool upland critters, some of whom we're going to talk about today, bees. So again, if you want to go back and watch our first webinar on YouTube, I will be sending everyone the link to our YouTube channel. You can go ahead and see some more numbers and a little bit more detail about lagoon-friendly landscaping and watershed-specific problems. We are not able to measure nitrogen or freshwater runoff that our garden is saving. Unfortunately, that's not within my scope of work and ability. However, we are able to monitor how much habitat we've created and what kind of quality of habitat we've created for bees and butterflies. So the goal of our monthly bee monitoring is to measure relative abundance, species diversity, and associations between species and habitats. We're trying to get folks excited about bees, like this native bee behind me, and use these amazing little critters to get people excited about lagoon-friendly landscaping and all of the cool stuff that can happen in your space, in your yard, when you decide to sort of cultivate a native plant landscape and bring back that native habitat versus pursuing a traditional European lawn, which often uses high amounts of fertilizer, lots of irrigation, and non-native species of plants, which is detrimental to the Indian River Lagoon and upland wildlife. So we brought that native landscape back on our property and sort of cultivated a native plant landscape. And when we compare our transect that we walk every month to the transect across the street in a traditional European style lawn, the number of bees we are seeing in our native plant garden versus that traditional lawn across the street is quite astonishing. So in our 12 months of monitoring so far, we have seen 176 bees on our side of the street in our garden transect, and we've only seen 2 when we are monitoring across the street on the traditional European style lawn. And we monitor for the same amount of time on our side as we do on the other side of the street. We spend the same amount of time, and everything is very much the same when we do our monitoring on both sides of the street. And the numbers really speak for themselves here of what an impact lagoon-friendly landscaping and Florida-friendly landscaping can make for bees in particular. So here are some photos of the stars of the show, some of the bees that we found in our garden. All bees of all different shapes and sizes and colors, which we are going to talk about today. Any questions about any of that lagoon-friendly landscaping and about how we do our monthly monitoring, please feel free to throw them in the chat box, and I will answer them at the end of the presentation. So let's get into the organisms of the hour, bees. So in Florida, we have around 315, sometimes I say 320, native bee species in Florida. So out of those 315 or 320, about 29 of them are endemic. So 29 of those bee species are only found in Florida and nowhere else in the world. We have around 4,000 species of bees in the US and about 20,000 species of bees found around the globe. Now we're going to dig into this even more as we go, but honeybees are not native to North America. Honeybees are not one of these native bee species that we're focusing on today. Native bees are mostly solitary nesters, nesting in small holes. About 70% of bees in North America nest underground in sort of tunnels, whereas that other 30% nest in plants or use sort of plant or natural materials to build small nests above ground. Native bees are better adapted and more diverse than honeybees, and they can do actually a better job of pollinating, particularly our native plants, because our native bees and native plants evolved together in this region over thousands of years. So our native bees are really essential for pollinating our native plants that are unique to Florida, which we definitely want to keep around. Unfortunately, nearly 1 in every 4 native bee species in the US is at risk of decline. Insects and insect data is tricky because not a lot of attention has been paid to them, unfortunately, our little insects. So out of 4,000 native bee species in the US, there is sufficient data, according to the Center for Biological Diversity, for about 14,000 of them. So out of the 4,000, out of the 4,000, 1,400 or 1,400 of these species have adequate numbers to run statistics on. So out of that 1,400, more than half are in decline. So that's sort of how they end up with that nearly 1 in 4 native bee species is at risk of decline. And the biggest threats to native bees are similar to our threats that impact butterflies. So development is a huge one, and lack of plant diversity is another huge impact on native bees. Also, the widespread use of pesticides is not helping them out. Also, herbicides as well, even though they're targeted to plants, can have some negative impacts on bee health and bee populations. And of course, climate change is another factor that is causing decline of our native bee species. So before we hop into all the cool, amazing bee species that we have in the state of Florida, we gotta run through some basics really quick. So bees belong to the order Hymenoptera, and this order includes wasps, bees, ants, and sawflies. Oh, I knew I was missing one, sawflies. Hornets as well. So bees, wasps, hornets, sawflies, and ants. Out of these couple of groups, bees are known to be the fuzziest. People refer to them as cotton candy with wings. They're really cute, really round, really fuzzy for the most part. Native bees have 3 major body parts, or I'm sorry, all bees, all Hymenoptera really, have 3 major body parts. The head, which I'm circling with my cursor, the thorax, and then the abdomen, which is that large part. During the presentation, I might refer to that as the bee's butt, because sometimes I find that easier to remember, but it's technically their abdomen. Female bees carry pollen on either their legs, abdomen, rear part of their thorax, or in an internal body part called a thorax. Female bees collect pollen and create pollen loafs for their offspring. So female bees are the ones that nest. They tend to be bigger. They tend to live a little longer. And what female bees are doing, in addition to collecting nectar, which both male bees and female bees do to sustain themselves, that's what bees eat is nectar. In addition to that, female bees are actively collecting pollen on purpose to make a little pollen loaf, is what they call it, and leave it for their offspring in the nest so that their offspring can eat that pollen loaf and grow into an adult bee and then fly away. So you'll see female bees specifically carrying pollen on different parts of their bodies to bring back to their nests. To find bumblebees can fly about 1 mile, leafcutter bees can fly about 1,500 feet, and bicolored sweat bees can fly about 500 feet. So I just threw that in there to let you know, if you do have a yard, which I know some of us don't, I don't have a yard, but I can always use a pollinator pot. Bees and small insects that are crucial to our environment and ecosystems can live their entire lives in one person's yard. If a bicolored sweat bee can really only fly about 500 feet to find food, it can also live, if you provide the correct habitat, its entire life cycle in a small yard. Honeybees are known to fly up to 6 miles, although I don't think that they are able to do that on a very regular basis. So we have many different morpho groups of bees that we use for our bee monitoring at our Titusville field station. So morpho groups are groups of organisms based on how they look and their physical characteristics, not necessarily their taxonomy in their scientific families. So for bee monitoring, since we are looking at flowers to identify different types of bees, we do that based on what they look like. So honeybees are pretty easy to see, and we'll talk about what they look like. Again, those are not a native bee species. And we have bumblebees, large carpenter bees, longhorn bees, turret and digger bees, leafcutter bees, mining bees, metallic bees, tiny bees, and cuckoo bees. So these are all different families of bees that have been broken down into groups based on what they look like. So this is the magical flow chart that we use for our Titusville field station monitoring for our monthly bee transects. So like we talked about a little bit, we walk through the garden along a transect line and we look at flowers to see how many bees we can find along that line within 7 minutes. If you decide to become part of our volunteer team, we'll go into this much more in depth, but for those of you who are just here to learn more about bees, I don't want to go too crazy. But this is how we have our bees organized based on look. So you can see our most large scale group is unknown flying insect. So if you see an insect on a flower, but you have no idea what it is, you can put unknown flying insect. Then if we're thinking, ooh, is it a bee or a wasp? Maybe it's a sawfly. Then we can use Hymenoptera and say, okay, well, I don't know if it's a bee or a wasp, but I know it's one of the two. Then looking at it and you go, you know what? It is definitely a bee, but I'm not sure which kind of bee. That's where our unknown bee category comes in. Now, once we jump into the native bee category, things get a little crazy, like you can see, because there's such a wide diversity. But the main categories that we want to be able to differentiate when we're looking at bees is it a honeybee or is it a native bee? Because remember, honeybees aren't native to this region, and they look quite a bit different than the rest of our native bees. So honeybees are our stereotypical bee species, right? This is the one that you think of when you hear the word bee. This is still the one that I think of when I hear the word bee, and I've been working with native bees for a couple of years now. So honeybees belong to the largest family of bees, and they're a medium-sized bee, about a half an inch. So this would be considered a medium-sized bee, about a half an inch in size, still quite small. They're torpedo-shaped. They are usually orangish brown, maybe have some black. There's a bit of color variation there, but they all have stripes on their abdomen. They all have a fuzzy thorax, and they carry wet pollen balls on their hind legs if they're a female honeybee, which is unusual. A lot of our native bees don't carry these kind of wet pollen balls. Usually it's drier. Honeybees are methodic flyers, flying from flower to flower, and they buzz when they fly. Again, these guys were introduced by Europeans. They are not native bees. They are essential for our agriculture and sort of our survival here in North America at this point, because they pollinate a lot of our agricultural crops, and of course we eat their honey. But these are not native bee species. They're therefore not a species of conservation concern. Instead, they're a species of concern for us because we rely on them for honey. But they're not a natural or native species. But here's what they look like. You all pretty much know what honeybees look like. Again, about 0.5 inches in size, torpedo-shaped. They're really North America's most iconic bee, I would say. So we'll just click through a couple pictures of these guys, kind of have that golden honey color. And again, this wet pollen ball on that thigh for those female honeybees. Some of them have a little bit darker coloring, some of them a little lighter, but they're all that typical honeybee look. So now let's get crazy. Let's hop into our native bees. So we have 6 major families of native bees. However, like you saw in our flowchart, we don't necessarily do things according to family. We do things according to what the bees actually look like. So our 6 major families, we have Apidae, Halictidae, Megachilidae, Adrenidae, Coletidae, and melitid bees. So melitid bees we're not going to worry about. They're north of us. But the rest of these guys you'll see in our different morpho groups. So back into the morpho group graphic, you all are going to see this a lot because, in my opinion, it's really the only way to keep things straight in your head when you're talking about so many different bees. So we now know what honeybees look like, right? This gray box. So check mark. We know what a honeybee looks like. Now we're going to hop into, like we said, those native bees. The first group of native bees we're going to talk about are big bees, which do happen to all be in the same family. So this does follow sort of that taxonomy for this section. So big bees all belong to the Apidae family. And the first group of big bees we're going to talk about are bumblebees. Oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself. We're talking about big bees. But the first group we're going to talk about are bumblebees. So we have about 5 species of bumblebee in Florida. They're all the genus Bombus. These are large bees. They're 6 to 1 inch. So this is a 1-inch bee, quite large. And our bumblebees are very, very fuzzy. Their entire body is fuzzy. We call them our teddy bears because they're big, fuzzy teddy bears. They make a low buzzing sound when they fly. The females, again, use that kind of unique wet pollen loaf, which you'll see later on is not found with a lot of our other native bee species. But our bumblebees are a little different. They're also our most social native bee. So we talked about how native bees all nest in the ground and they're more solitary nesters. Bumblebees are native bees. They're native to North America. However, their social structure is more similar to honeybees than it is to other native bees. So they do have a colony structure with a queen bee and worker bees, and they do actually collect and create honey. However, bumblebees do not produce enough honey for us humans to benefit from, so we don't use them for that purpose like we do for European honeybees. So again, bumblebees are large, they're robust, and they're fuzzy. So as you'll see in all these pictures that we click through, these guys are our big teddy bears. Very fuzzy, fuzzy in the abdomen, about 1 inch in size. So now we're going to go ahead and jump to our next group of bees. Like in our butterfly webinar, this one's going to be kind of fast-paced because we have a lot of different bees to cover. So the next group of bees we're going to talk about are large carpenter bees. That is next to the bumblebees under our big bee category. So large carpenter bees, we only have 2 species of these guys in Florida, and they are also very large. Again, about 1 inch in size, about the same size as a bumblebee. So I would say these 2 groups are easily confused until you know the trick to tell them apart. So large carpenter bees look a lot like bumblebees. However, they have a shiny, dark abdomen. So their abdomen is very much hairless, whereas with bumblebees, the abdomen is very hairy. So we went from fuzzy teddy bear to now a bee with a shiny butt. So they have very little hair on their abdomen. But again, about the same size. Male carpenter bees might buzz you. Don't worry. Male bees do not have stingers. Only female bees have stingers. So they're just trying to scare you away from their territory, even though they have nothing to defend themselves with. And female large carpenter bees do have large mandibles, and they like to make their nests in wood. So sometimes people have a hard time with these guys making tunnels into their wood benches and structures, or even their outdoor patios. But we love them anyways. So here are one of our species of large carpenter bee. Again, with that shiny butt, that hairless abdomen. Same with these guys. So again, it kind of looks like a bumblebee, but it's not, because as you can see, that abdomen is very hairless and quite shiny. Now, in this category, we have a bee who's not actually a large carpenter bee. This bee is just pretending. So this is a leafcutter bee pretending to be a large carpenter bee, and you can tell the difference because this bee is collecting pollen on its belly or on the underside of its abdomen, which our large carpenter bees do not do that. This bee is also a little bit smaller than our large carpenter bees. So you may be able to tell the difference when you are out looking for bees between a large carpenter bee and this carpenter bee mimic, but if not, it's okay because they do look quite similar. So if we look back at our bee morpho group flowchart, you can see under our large carpenter bee category, we have our 2 species, which are both Xylocopa genus, and then you can see in that blue, that Megachile mimic, that is the bee under the large carpenter bee category that is just pretending. So now we're going to move on to our next group, which is the medium big bee group. So you can kind of see this blue colored swoop here at the bottom, medium big bee. So the medium big bee group is made up of 2 different kind of smaller groups of bees, longhorn bees and turret or digger bees. So again, you can see here our longhorn bee group and our turret or digger bee group are both underneath that medium big bee umbrella. And we have this medium big bee umbrella because these groups are kind of difficult to tell apart. So our longhorn bees, it's really easy to tell if you're looking at a longhorn bee if it's a male, because male longhorn bees have really long antennae that look way too long for their body. These bees are sort of a medium to large size, so probably around a honeybee size with that 0.5 inches, or even a little larger, getting up closer to that bumblebee size of about 0.7 inches. These guys fly fast and smooth. And again, you know if you're looking at a male longhorn bee because the antennae are huge. However, female longhorn bees just have really robust hind legs and look extra fuzzy on the leg. So that's a little bit harder to tell. So that's why these bees are actually in that medium big bee category, because you can really only tell if they're a longhorn bee if it's a male. So we'll click through these really quick. As you can see, the males have quite long antennae, especially on this guy. Really got those long horns, whereas the females have kind of a thick, I would call, thigh area if we just want to make it easy. But again, here's a male with those ridiculously long antennae. Here's a female with a very hairy hind leg, which again, a lot of our bees have, so that makes it more difficult. You really probably are only going to be able to identify a longhorn bee in the field if it's a male. And longhorn bees include squash bees, which we don't really see in the garden because we don't have much squash. These are more of a North Florida genus as well. So back to our bee morpho groups. Last group of big bees is also within this medium big bee category, easily confused with the longhorn bee, are the turret and digger bees. So this group of bees is about the same size as our longhorn bees. So they're about the size of that honeybee or a little bit bigger, probably between the size of a honeybee and a bumblebee. They look like bumblebees. They're robust. They kind of have that bumblebee coloring. However, they're smaller than they should be. Digger bee species nest mostly underground, kind of varies by species, whereas turret bees construct mud turrets, like in this photo, using water to kind of create these tunnels or turrets. So here's a picture of some of these guys. Again, they're around honeybee size, but they have sort of a bumblebee appearance. So they're still in the big bee category. If you were looking at them, you know that they're not a bumblebee because they're too small, but they're also not one of our smaller species of bees in the other category. So you know it would be a medium big bee, possibly a digger bee. So now we are going to hop back into our flowchart again. I told you were going to be seeing this a lot. So now we've covered all of our big bees. So this family Apidae covers honeybees, as well as all of the big bees here in this red and pink coloring. So if a bee is less than 1/2 inch in size, so less than the size of a honeybee, it's going to go into our small, medium bee categories. So the first category we're going to talk about is our small to medium striped bees, and this includes our leafcutter bees and our mining bees. So if we look at our flowchart again, we're looking at a native bee, and it's small to medium size, and it has a striped abdomen. So we're looking at this area here, small to medium striped bee. Underneath it, we have two categories, leafcutter bees and mining bees. And within these two categories, we have little subcategories. Like within leafcutter bees, we have color cutters, we have hoplitus bees as well. So the first group we're going to talk about is that leafcutter category, the Megachile family, where we have those color cutter bees and those hoplitus bees as well. So we have about 75 species of leafcutter bee in Florida, or bees that would fit into this category. And all these bees are sort of small to medium size, so that honeybee size or smaller. And all of these bees, for the most part, have striped abdomen, and they all have very fuzzy bellies. People refer to these bees as flying Cheetos. You can kind of see in this picture of this bee here, all the pollen underneath its abdomen. That's supposed to look like a flying Cheeto. So they're quite robust. They have kind of big head and jaws. Often when they're on flowers, you'll see them kind of bumping their butt up and down and holding their abdomen up in the air. And this is what the leafcutter bee nests sort of look like. So for leafcutter bees, they cut leaves and use them sort of as little brood cell partitions. Resin bees use plant resin, so you can see that in that sort of middle area of the photograph. And then mason bees use mud to partition their brood cells. And again, remember, female bees are bringing back pollen for these little brood cells. So they lay their eggs, bring a pollen loaf. The egg hatches, turns into a larva, eats all the pollen, goes into a pupa stage, which is what's happening here on the bottom, and then emerges as an adult bee. The leafcutter bees are all bees that nest above ground for the most part. And they all have a fuzzy belly. That's what we're really looking at. So they're small to medium-sized bees with a fuzzy belly. They like to hold their abdomen up in the air and do that little butt bump. So again, fuzzy belly, striped. See that flying Cheeto there? They're kind of chunky because they use their jaws to munch on leaves. Again, you can see all the pollen under this female's belly. And now we are in the color cutter category. So you'll notice these are leafcutter bees. They still have that fuzzy belly, but they are different colors. We have yellows and reds here in Florida. So again, kind of that stocky looking small to medium-sized bee with a hairy belly. And we have varieties of yellow and red for our color cutter bees in Florida. Florida pebble bee. We have a red pebble bee pictured here in Florida. All the other pebble bees in North America are yellow. Florida is the only state with a red pebble bee. This is one of our endemic bees here in Florida. We also have Hoplitis as a genus in this category, and these guys are kind of small. So if we accidentally put them in the smaller tiny bee category, that's okay because they're easily mixed up there. But they have these fuzzy bellies. That's the major component for leafcutter bees, is they have a fuzzy belly. So back to our small, medium striped bee major overarching group. Those were all of our leafcutter bees. Now we're going to go ahead and look at our mining bees that are under this category. So again, all these bees are honeybee size or smaller for the most part. And they just differentiate between how much hair is on the bottom of their abdomen. So the leafcutter bees that we just talked about have very fuzzy, very hairy bottom sides of their abdomen, whereas mining bees have smooth underside of their abdomen, and instead they carry their pollen on sort of their upper thorax and a little bit of that hind leg there. So in the mining bee group, we have plaster bees, furrow bees, and then your typical mining bee. So this whole group of bees that has a smooth stomach, these guys all make nests underground. So they dig little tunnels, and then as you can see, these are the little brood cells at the bottom of the tunnels. So plaster bees or cellophane bees actually excrete this plasticky substance that they line their nests with to sort of help protect from water. And furrow bees are sort of a type of sweat bee. It's a Halictidae bee. And these guys that we'll talk about at the end of this mining bee section can have sort of a social structure. Again, for native bees, most of them are completely solitary. They don't have any sort of colony whatsoever, except for bumblebees, and then also some of the Halictidae bees have some sort of social structure, although not as intense as honeybees. So let's look at some photos of bees in the mining bee group. So again, they have that smooth belly. They have more hair on their legs than their abdomen. So here you can see pollen on this bee's leg instead of the abdomen. Again, kind of sleek, quite small, right? These guys are about a 1/2 inch to 0.3 inch. So they're a small bee. As you can see in these pictures, that's someone's fingernail. So these bees are quite small. They all have a smooth belly. Instead, they carry pollen on their legs and upper thorax or lower thorax. But again, smooth belly, striped bees, kind of that small to medium size. We also have these cellophane bees in this category that we talked about. And then these are the Halictus bees that are a little bit more social, like we said. But again, they do not have that super fuzzy belly. They're a little bit slimmer than our leaf cutter bees who need those big jaws for leaf cutting. Small to medium striped bees. So if you see a bee that has stripes like a honeybee, but you know that's not a honeybee, it could very possibly be a small to medium striped bee. So that would either lend itself to the leaf cutter bee category or the mining bee category, which, as you saw, have two very different nesting and life strategies. The next group we're going to talk about are metallic bees. This is a really fun group, and behind me is a metallic bee as well. So we have metallic sweat bees, which are in that Halictidae family, and then we also have metallic mason bees, which are the OSMIA species. So sweat bees that are metallic have 4 genuses. They all start with A's, and they're sort of medium size, about the size of a honeybee. And mason bees in this category, the osmia bees, they're actually blue. They're a little bit smaller, but overall we have about 20 species of metallic bee in Florida, which is really cool. I love seeing these guys fly around. So this metallic bee group, everybody's a little bit more slender, and females carry pollen on their hind legs. They don't. That leafcutter bee fuzzy belly is really particular to that sort of family and group. These guys fly fast, so they're hard to get photos of, they're hard to catch, and they can be hard to identify, but thankfully they're quite colorful. So this is one of our metallic sweat bees. Again, that sort of medium size, so this is considered a small bee, so 0.3 inches. This is considered sort of honeybee sized, or 0.5 inches. So these guys are relatively small to medium size. And of course, they have that quite bright green color. There's another green metallic sweat bee. So all of our metallic sweat bees are this kind of greenish, maybe a hint of blue, but mostly green. That small to medium size, and that really beautiful metallic green color. Some of them have black and white stripes as well on the abdomen, but have a green thorax and head. These are bees you're definitely going to notice when you see them in the garden, or if you come to do monitoring with us. Now, we have a non-native species of bee in Florida, besides the honeybee, and that is the dilemma orchid bee. So these bees are not native, and compared to our native sweat bees, these guys are much larger and bulkier looking. So they have sort of plated legs, which is unique. We don't have any native bees with those really thick plates on their legs. These guys have really long tongues, which our metallic bees don't have long tongues. And they're quite a bit larger and bulkier. I think these guys kind of look like Transformers. If anybody's seen the Transformers movies where it's the alien cars and they're all like robots, these things look like robots to me. So we shouldn't be seeing them all the way up in TITUSVILLE. Common to see in the southern parts of the states. They are very beautiful. They're fun to watch. They hover a lot, which is unusual for bees. However, they are non-native. So I'm sort of hoping that we don't see a ton of them in the garden, because that would mean that they're spreading further and further north. But keep an eye out for these guys. They're non-native metallic bees. We're not supposed to have them. They think that they ended up coming into our region because they had a nest in a pallet that came from Mexico, is what I had read. I don't know who figured that out, but so they say. I think that was a UF article that I read. So another group of metallic bees that we have here in Florida that are native are our osmia bees. So these guys are a little bit smaller, and they're more of a blue color. So as you can see, these pictures of these plants are quite close. So these guys are small blue metallic bees. Some of them have stripes. But again, our metallic sweat bees are larger in green, like the one behind me, whereas this guy on the slide is smaller and more blue. Osmia bees are actually part of that Megachile family. So you can see this bee has pollen all on its belly. So this bee does have a hairy belly because it's part of that leafcutter family technically, but since it's metallic and we do our groups based on what these animals look like, this bee goes into our metallic bee grouping. And there is a species of metallic osmia bee that is endemic and is very rare and is only found in central Florida in that scrub habitat that we have there up on the Florida Ridge. So let's go ahead and look back again at our morpho groups. And you can see under metallic bees, we have those metallic sweat bees. Again, those are the bigger, greener metallic bees like this guy behind me. And then the osmia bees, which are those smaller blue colored metallic bees. Now, a really fun group, tiny bees. I would say they're a fun group to talk about, maybe not such a fun group to have to look for, but very fun again when you find them, because these guys are hard to spot. Tiny bees are about the size of a grain of rice. So tiny bees are made up of a bunch of different bee families, but for our morpho groups, we put all of them together because they're all so darn tiny. So I'll go ahead. This is the size of a small bee. So the biggest bees in our tiny bee group would be about this size. This is the 0.3 inches. Whereas tiny bees, true tiny bees, can be as small as 0.1 inches. So can you even see that little bee I have on the magnet is bigger than the bee is. Very super tiny. There's my fingernails. Very, very small. The size of a short grain of rice, not even a long grain. So the whole theme that makes a bee a tiny bee is just how darn small it is. Again, they're all different families. And you really have to, if you're looking for tiny bees, you might really have to look deep into flowers to find them. But they're really cool. We have these masked bees that are wearing little masks. But again, all these bees are less than 0.3 inches. They're all small to tiny in size, which for a bee, that's saying something because all bees are pretty small. They're all less than about an inch, but these guys are super, super tiny. The fiery cyclops bee is pretty cool. The females are red and the males are black. We have some golden colored bees in this category as well. Very beautiful and very tiny. So keep an eye out for these guys in your garden. Like we said, these bees are of all different families. They're just all so tiny that they ended up in this tiny morpho group category. Now here's a Florida carpenter bee, and it is on a frog fruit flower, which we have in the garden. And I took a piece of frog fruit just to show you for scale. So here's me, here's my little frog fruit flower. Here's my fingers. See how tiny? These are the little matchstick flowers that you see in your lawn. Sometimes they're a very common Florida weed. They're a native species. But here's how tiny those little white flowers are. Very, very little. And as you can see, that whole bee fits within those tiny white flowers. This one's really cool. This particular bee in this category is a cuckoo bee, which we'll talk about soon. And this particular bee species holds its wings underneath its abdomen, which is quite unique. But we have lots of tiny bees in Florida. So keep an eye out for those guys. You're going to have to look really close. And that's why when we do our bee monitoring at the Titusville Garden, we particularly don't count bees that are flying in the air. We only count bees that are on flowers. So what we do for our monitoring is we scan the area for flowers and look at the flowers to see if there's any sort of activity going on, because those tiny bees are hard to catch. So you have to look very closely. So we've covered pretty much all the native bees in the state of Florida, except for our one final group, the cuckoo bee. So cuckoo bees are very interesting. Cuckoo bees are kleptoparasites. And these kleptoparasitic bees usually keen in on one or two like bee families or bee species, and they commit parasitism by theft. So what they do is brood parasitism. So the female cuckoo bee will find a potential host. So it's usually some type of bee. So there will be, like, let's say a leafcutter cuckoo bee. So the cuckoo bee will find a leafcutter bee home, the female bee home. It will wait for that adult female bee to leave. And then the female cuckoo bee will go into that leafcutter bee nest and deposit her own eggs in there. So it can either happen two ways. Either the female bee, when she goes in to essentially rob that other bee, she either kills the young that are in there already, or she just lays her eggs, and when her offspring emerge, her offspring kills the young of the original bee family. So that way, what has happened is another female bee has made her little pollen loaf, dug the burrow, got everything set up, laid her eggs, and then the female cuckoo bee swoops in and deposits her own eggs and kills the original offspring. That way, the other female bee has done all the work, and the mom of the cuckoo bee has just gone in and reaped all of the reward. So cuckoo bees are not known to really negatively impact native bee populations. It's just sort of a part of the ecosystem. And it's actually a good thing if you're seeing cuckoo bees in your native plant garden, because that means that you might have a pretty stable bee population. These guys are small to medium size again, so sort of this 0.3 to 0.5 inch, maybe even a little bigger. And these guys look more like wasps than bees. because they're not actively going out and foraging for pollen for their young. They're just kind of taking advantage of others. So they are allowed to look a little bit less hairy and more like wasps because they don't need to put in the work to go collect pollen. They still drink nectar, so you still find them on flowers. However, they all look much more wasp-like. So it's kind of like a bee-wasp combo is how they look. But they are bees that are just taking advantage of the work of others. We have a variety of colors. They all have much rather pointed abdomen than our other bees. So we talk about bees as being fuzzy cotton candy with wings. Our cuckoo bees are definitely the exception to that. Again, they all look a little wasp-like. They can be kind of brightly colored, but they're drinking nectar like bees would. All right, those were all of the native bees in Florida by morpho group. We didn't talk about every single species, but you've now seen pictures of pretty much all of the species that you would see in the Indian River Lagoon region. So congratulations to you all, you've survived. Really quick, we'll talk about bees versus wasps and bees versus flies, and then we'll do our little wrap up. So bees versus wasps. Now, we just talked about cuckoo bees, right? Which are they kind of look a little bit more wasp-like, but wasps are hairless, they're narrow, they're actually built to be sleek predators. So bees and wasps are in the same order. Bees actually evolved from wasps. So as flowering plants came into existence, in the time of the dinosaurs, there were not really flowering plants. They were mostly cycads. So they were ferns and plants that would reproduce using water and air to spread and reproduce. However, when flowering plants evolved, so did bees. So essentially what happened is some wasps decided that they didn't want to hunt anymore. They wanted to become vegan and turn into bees and use flowers instead. So that's why they look so similar, but that's also why they look so different. Bees evolved to become fuzzier, covered in hair, quite round, because they're feasting on flowers, whereas wasps kept that narrow, sleek predator look because they're still catching insects in our carnivores. So wasps dangle their legs in flight. That's a big difference. Bees don't really do that besides those orchid bees, which are non-native. And bees are fuzzy, they're round, they're kind of goofy, to be honest, most of the time, and there are cotton candy with wings. So that's really the two differences physically, looks-wise between them. And then bees and flies. Flies are in a different family. They're in the Diptera family. They only have 2 wings total, whereas bees and wasps have 4 wings. Flies have shorter antennae, and flies, the thing that gives them away is their eyes. They have those big fly eyes. It's just kind of one giant, massive eyeball on the top of their head, whereas bees have eyes that sit on the side of their heads and are definitely separated. So we have a couple fly species in the garden that like to pretend to be bees because they want to pretend that they have a stinger. And those fly species would trick us if we didn't really pay attention to their eyes. Again, fly eyes have those big, massive eyes on the top of their heads, whereas bees have eyes on the side. And that can be a big difference because those flies that are pretending to be bees are pretty good at it. And you'll see, of course, bees carrying pollen, especially if they're females, or the males just end up covered in pollen because they're crawling into flowers all the time. Bees are very, very important pollinators in pretty much every ecosystem. They're the #1 pollinator globally. So bees are really fuzzy and really built for crawling into flowers and getting all covered in pollen. So these are all of our native bee morpho groups for our region. We have big bees, which include the turret and digger bees, longhorn bees, large carpenter bees, and bumblebees. And then we have the small or medium-sized bees, which are smaller than a honeybee would be. Our leafcutter bees, our mining bees, our tiny bees, our metallic bees, and our cuckoo bees. So here's our morpho groups again, just wrapped up. Our leafcutter bees include the resin, pebble, and mason bees. Remember, leafcutters have that fuzzy belly. Mining bees are those bees that dig holes. They are mining, right, underground. Metallic bees, of course, are beautiful and shiny. Tiny bees are the size of short grain rice, and our cuckoo bees are sort of our wasp-like bees. So, you all have finished all 3 webinars if you are still with us from the beginning. Thank you all so much. If you missed a webinar, I will be sending the YouTube link tomorrow, but the YouTube channel we are posting on is Friends of the Spoil Islands. That's our citizen support organization that created the YouTube channel for us so that we could share our educational material online. If you are looking to become a volunteer with us, all you got to do is watch our 3 webinars. You can watch them later on YouTube if you miss one, and shoot me an email. Hopefully you can come to our Pollinator Palooza on Saturday. I would love to see you all there. And if you want to become a volunteer, shoot me an email, let me know, and we can either make sure you're trained at Pollinator Palooza or that you meet up with me later to do the in-person component. This was just a crash course on bees. We have plenty of resources I'm going to send to you all once we wrap up. And if you don't have the time or you live too far away to come up and join us in Titusville, there are plenty of things you can do to help the Indian River Lagoon at home. Or our office is in Fort Pierce, and we do work all up and down the lagoon, so you can help us on a project closer to you. So again, this is our 3rd webinar in IRLAP Pollinator Month. Hopefully you can join us on Saturday for Pollinator Palooza. We're going to have a scavenger hunt. We're going to be catching bees and wasps. We're going to have a honey tasting. We're going to have lots of raffle prizes. So hopefully you can join us on Saturday. And thank you to all of the organizations and people who helped me come up with this program and do all of this research. This is a really cool photo, actually, really quick before we wrap up. This is one of our, I actually can't tell from this angle. It looks like a bumblebee. I was thinking maybe for a second it was a carpenter bee, but it looks a little too fuzzy. So this bumblebee is nectar robbing. So what this bee is doing is, instead of crawling into the flower to drink nectar and then getting covered in pollen, which helps the flower out, this bee is just cheating the system and biting into the flower to suck the nectar out without doing the flower a service, without collecting pollen. It's just robbing the nectar from the flower without benefiting the flower. So that's a really cool photo that one of our volunteers got in the garden. But anyways, thank you to everyone who has helped me with this program and whose information and resources I used. And thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I truly appreciate your time. And if you all have any questions, please feel free to throw them into the chat box. It is 6:54, so we have a few minutes. You all can ask away any questions you have about bees or our programming, and I'm happy to answer for the next few minutes. Thank you all again so much for attending. All right, great question. Are any bees invasive? So, not that I can think of off of the top of my head in our region. The dilemma orchid bee is definitely non-native, and the honeybee is non-native, but I don't think any of those are considered invasive at this point. So for those of you who don't know, invasive species are non-native species who do harm to the ecosystem and to other species. So I can't think of any bees in our region that are not native that are actively doing harm. However, Florida is a hotspot for invasives of all kinds, so it could potentially happen in the future. All right, quick little talk about bees and stings while we have a few extra minutes. So we mentioned in the presentation only female bees can sting, and native bees, since they are mostly solitary nesters, again, the only native bees we have that live in social colonies are bumblebees and some of our sweat bees. Since most of our native bees are solitary, they're really not aggressive. So it's very rare, I would say, to get stung by a native bee. I've been working in this native plant garden now, specifically targeting bees, and I've been actively catching bees in nets and vials and handling them. And I have not been stung by any bees or wasps. I've only been bitten by fire ants, which is an invasive species of ant. So native bees often don't sting. And female native bees, though, can sting you over and over again. Honeybees have this weird barbed stinger that gets stuck in mammalian skin, and that's why honeybees die when they sting you, because they go to fly away and it kind of rips their body apart. Whereas all of our native bee species don't have that weird barb. They can sting us over and over again if they wanted to, but again, only the females can, and they usually don't because they don't have a colony that they're defending. Instead, they're just kind of bopping from flower to flower. Any other questions? Feel free to go ahead and throw them in the chat. Scanning the chat to see if we have anybody typing. All right, for those of you who can join us on Sunday, I had someone ask this question in the chat earlier, or I'm sorry, Saturday, not Sunday. We are having our Pollinator Palooza event on Saturday at the Titusville field station. The event is running from 9:30 to noon. And like I said, we're going to have a honey tasting. We're going to have raffle prizes. I'll be out in the garden catching bees and wasps to look at up close safely. And we are also going to be doing an organism scavenger hunt. So you can practice your plant ID, your bee and butterfly ID, and have some fun with us. Check out our garden in person. So if you are able to make it on Sunday, all are welcome, all ages, even if you haven't attended any of the webinar. We just want to get people outside, enjoying the garden, and think about pollinators, as this week is officially National Pollinator Week. So if you all are able to join us, that would be awesome. I'll go ahead when we wrap up the webinars. Like I said, you'll get the YouTube links, and as always, you'll get our follow-up email with the resources. I'll also go ahead and send out our Pollinator Palooza flyer. So you all will get that, and hopefully I will see you all at the field station on Saturday. So thank you all so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time. I hope that you learned something new. And again, thank you all so much for joining us here at the Indian River Lagoon Aquatic Preserves. Hope to see you all in person sometime soon. Have a great night. Bye-bye.